The last of the covenants we'll be studying up this weekend is the one we are now dealing with, and that is the New Covenant. And normally I would introduce this with the reading of Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 34, but that was just now read. So turn your scriptures to the passage that has been read in Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 34. For this passage alone, what we learn is that the persons involved in the making of the new covenant is both God and Israel. And for Israel, it is a replacement of the Mosaic covenant, which was no longer in effect. Once the Messiah died and ascended into heaven, that is when the Mosaic covenant has ceased to function. What's functioning now is the new covenant. And so it's a replacement of the Mosaic covenant that's no longer operative for the time being. Now let's provide some of the provisions, and let's look at the passage I was just read. First of all, in verse 31, this is an unconditional covenant involving God and both houses of Israel, Israel and Judah. Then in verse 32, it is also distinct from the Mosaic covenant. It's not an elaboration of the Mosaic covenant. It's not a renewal or a renewed covenant, but it is a replacement of the Mosaic covenant. So in verse 33, it emphasizes the result of the new covenant ultimately leads to a regeneration of the people of Israel. Our corollary verse to verse 33 is Isaiah chapter 59, verse 21. Isaiah 59, verse 21. And the key blessing of this new covenant is the blessing of salvation, and ultimately it guarantees Israel's national salvation. In the first part of verse 34, the regeneration will be universal among all Jews around the world. Another corollary verse is Isaiah chapter 61, verse 9. Isaiah 61, verse 9. And so throughout the kingdom, all Jews will eventually come to believe. Unbelievers will be found only among the Gentiles. And a key blessing of this covenant is a blessing of salvation, especially in this context, applicable to Israel and Israel's own national salvation. And the final point it makes is at the end of verse 34, the forgiveness of sin. The Mosaic covenant merely covered sin, but the new covenant will now be removing the nature of sin. And the corollary blessing to the new covenant is the covenant of salvation. Now, the sixth element that we find elsewhere in the scriptures is the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. This is indicated in chapter 31, verse 33, and it correlates well with Ezekiel chapter 36 and verse 27. Ezekiel 36, verse 27. The Mosaic covenant failed to provide the power to keep its demands, but the new covenant provides the necessary power. It will provide the inward power. And now we see a blessing resulting from the blessing of salvation. A seventh element is the promise of material blessings. This is found, for example, in Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 41. Also in two other passages outside of Jeremiah, and that includes Isaiah chapter 61, verse 8, Isaiah 61, verse 8, and Ezekiel chapter 34, verses 25 to 27. Ezekiel 34, verses 25 to 27. And again, as you look at the Mosaic covenant, it promised material blessings for obedience. But the new covenant now is showing the regeneration that will come upon the people of Israel will come with unconditional material blessings. An eighth element is that the rebuilding of the sanctuary. That's provided in Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 26 to 28. Ezekiel 37, verses 26 to 28. So the Mosaic covenant provided the building of the tabernacle. The Davidic covenant provided for the first and second temples. And now the millennial temple will be based upon the new covenant. The ninth element involved in this is the law of the Messiah. And the law of the Messiah are the many individual commandments from the Messiah and the apostles applicable to the New Testament believer. As the law of Messiah began to provide a new type of sanctuary, and this came initially from Messiah directly, but after Messiah's ascension, the work of the apostles was applicable to the New Testament believer in continuing to build a sanctuary of some kind. The two key passages here are Romans chapter 8, verse 2. Romans 8, verse 2 talks about the law of the Spirit of life. The law of the Spirit of life. And then Galatians chapter 6, verse 2, Galatians 6, 2 mentions the law of the Messiah. The law of the Messiah. And what the law of the Messiah provides is specific provisions. First of all, many commandments that are now found in the law of the Messiah are the same as those of the law of Moses. For example, 9 of the 10 commandments that were found in the law of Moses is also found here in the law of the Messiah. So 9 of the 10 is repeated. And this is the reason there is confusion as to which law the rule of life is to be functioning at the moment of time. A second thing to note is that many commandments, many things are different from the law of Moses. So you had, first of all, many commandments were the same, but now you have many commandments which were different from the law of Moses, such as there's no mandatory Shabbat or Sabbath commandment. This comes out of Romans chapter 14, verse 5, Romans 14, 5, and Colossians chapter 2, verse 16, Colossians 2:16. Furthermore, there's no mandatory dietary code as there was in the Mosaic issues. And so there's no dietary code that's demanded anymore. And this is brought out in Mark chapter 7, verse 19, Mark 7, verse 19. Also Romans chapter 14, verse 20, Romans 14:20. A third thing to notice is that some commandments are intensified. For example, the Mosaic commandment says, love your neighbor as yourself. You found this in Leviticus 19, verse 18, among other passages. The Mosaic covenant, this was viewed as a very important commandment. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. But as we come to the new covenant, it intensifies what the Mosaic covenant said. The new covenant says, love one another as Messiah loved you. Coming from the Gospel of John, chapter 15, verse 12. John 15, verse 12. A fourth element involved here is that there is now a new motivation in light of the new covenant. In the Mosaic covenant, the Mosaic covenant declared, do this in order to be blessed. Do this in order to be blessed. But the new covenant now says, you have been now blessed with every blessing, therefore do. You've already been blessed with every blessing, therefore do. So let's provide the explanation for why there's been some confusion here. Well, basically we're told now in the New Covenant material that we are now under a new law today. And the new law has many of the same commandments as the Mosaic covenant, but it's not because a part of the Mosaic covenant has been retained. It's a brand new law code that has the same laws as the law of Moses. But just as the Noahic covenant has had similarities with the Edenic covenant from the Garden of Eden, by the same token we see a comparison similar to what's happening here. Now, several passages we need to look at that provides confirmation about the validity of the commandments coming out through the new covenant. Isaiah chapter 55, verse 3. Isaiah 55, verse 3 declares, I will make an everlasting covenant with you, even the sure mercies of David. Isaiah chapter 59, verse 21. Isaiah 59:21, this covenant will result in their receiving of the Holy Spirit. Isaiah chapter 61, verses 8 and 9. Isaiah 61, verses 8 and 9, verse 8 says, I will make an everlasting covenant with them. And follow up in verse 9, the result is, Israel will be known as the seed blessed of Yahweh, the seed blessed of Jehovah. Another element is Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 40. Jeremiah 32, verse 40, I will make an everlasting covenant with them, resulting in Israel's national salvation. And so there will be someday when all Israel will be saved. This will be as a result of the outworking of the new covenant. Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 60. Ezekiel 16:60, I remember my covenant with you in the days of your youth, and that is the land covenant. I will establish unto you an everlasting covenant, and that's the information found in the new covenant. Ezekiel chapter 34, verses 25 to 31. Ezekiel 34, verses 25 to 31, the covenant of peace will result in material prosperity. Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 26 to 28. Ezekiel 37, 26 to 28, the covenant will be the covenant of peace, and it will be an everlasting covenant. That's the point of verse 26. Verse 27, God's tabernacle will be with Israel, and there will be a tabernacle erupted in the Messianic kingdom. And finally, verse 28, Israel as a people, as a nation, will be sanctified by God himself. Now let's look at one example we could look at, and that's Romans 11. Romans chapter 11. And we'll look at verses 25 to 27. Romans 11, 25 to 27. For I would not have you, brethren, have you ignorant of this mystery, lest ye be wise in your own conceits. The hardening in part hath befallen Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. And so all Israel shall be saved. Even as is written, there shall come out of Zion the deliverer. He shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. And this is my covenant unto them when I shall take away their sins. In coming to a closing part of Romans 11, he points out that he does not want the readers reading what has been delivered by Paul, something that they should avoid ignoring, but pay attention with much detail. And so in these three verses, he points out the new covenant will result in all Israel being saved. Not all Israel of all time, but all Israel of a certain point of time. And that will be at this point of time when the whole nation of Israel will come to faith, and that is while they become believers. Now, moving into our next segment is the issue of the importance of the new covenant. It involves, first of all, it amplifies the blessing aspect of the Abrahamic covenant, especially the blessings of salvation. And it shows just how the spiritual blessings are going to be extended to the Gentile world, as is extended to the Jewish world. And showing how the church can relate to the new covenant. So far, all the scriptures we quoted have been quoted and have been related somehow with the Jewish people. So all scriptures cited so far connect the new covenant only with Israel. The scriptures which connect the new covenant with the church. But what do they mean when connecting with the church? Matthew, Mark, and Luke each have one passage that deal with the new covenant. So Matthew's gospel, one verse, Matthew 26, verse 28, Matthew 26, verse 28, and Mark chapter 14, also one verse, verse 24. But Luke gives us a more extended amount of material. Luke chapter 22, verses 14 through 20. Luke 22, verses 14 through 20, shows that in some capacity, the church is connected to the new covenant. Exactly how, we'll see as we continue some of the passages. Moving outside of the three Gospels, we have in two writings of Paul, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 26, 1 Corinthians 11, verse 26, and in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 6. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 6. In these two occasions, Paul is somehow connecting the new covenant with the Jewish people and somehow connected with the Corinthian church. Now we have several passages coming from the book of Hebrews, which is an epistle written to the Messianic Jewish community. And the passages from Hebrews are as follows: Hebrews chapter 7, verse 22, Hebrews 7, 22, and Hebrews chapter 8, verse 6, Hebrews 8, verse 6. In both these passages, it talks about a better covenant, a better covenant. Now we have some others from the book of Hebrews, and keep in mind, this is an epistle written and addressed specifically to a Messianic Jewish community. And these include Hebrews chapter 8, verses 7 through 13, Hebrews 8, 7 through 13, Hebrews chapter 9, verse 15, Hebrews 9, verse 15, Hebrews chapter 10, verses 16 and 29, Hebrews 10, verses 16 and verse 29, Hebrews chapter 12, verse 24, Hebrews 12, 24, and one more, Hebrews chapter 13, verse 20, Hebrews 13, verse 20. And as the author of Hebrews writes, he's not writing to the church at large, he's specifically writing and addressing the Messianic Jewish community. So the whole issue comes out, how do we solve the various connections about the outworking of the new covenant? Now, one issue is that of covenant theology. Covenant theology is a theology of transference, a theology of replacement. It's a covenant theology where it claims that the church has taken over all of Israel's covenants. It's no longer a Jewish covenant, it's now a church covenant. And the promises are now being fulfilled spiritually in and through and by the church. That's what covenant theology teaches. The problem is that it requires an allegorical interpretation of the other covenants as well as this one, and requires ignoring the details, such as Abraham was told to walk the whole length of the land, walk the whole breadth of the land, for he will someday inherit it. That was back in Genesis chapter 13, verses 14 to 17. And that's one way that they have decided to try to settle, but it seems to be a contradiction. Another option to try to solve it is there's only one new covenant, but it has two different aspects. This was Scofield's view in the Scofield Bible. There is only one new covenant, but it's two different aspects. One aspect is for Israel, and one aspect is for the church. However, there's no clear division ever given as to which aspect is for Israel and which aspect is for the church. It claims to have these two divisions, but never actually applies it or shows how this works. A third option is claiming is that there are actually two new covenants. There was one new covenant with Israel, and two passages in Hebrews focuses on the new covenant with Israel. That's Hebrews 8, verses 7 through 13, Hebrews 8, 7 through 13, and Hebrews chapter 10, verse 16, Hebrews 10, 16. But there's a second new covenant which was made with the church. And three passages in Hebrews as identified or somehow interpreted as being made with the church. And the three passages they use is Hebrews chapter 8, verse 6, Hebrews 8, 6, Hebrews chapter 7, verse 22, Hebrews 7, 22, and Hebrews chapter 13, verse 20, Hebrews 13, 20. And the three passages I quoted earlier from Matthew, Mark, and Luke also claims that this is a new covenant made with the church. They also apply two of Paul's letters, also identifying it as being a new covenant made with the church. 1 Corinthians 11:25, 1 Corinthians 11:25 and 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 6. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 6. And still others took 7 verses from about the New Covenant and applied it to both the Jewish people and the church. And that was Hebrews chapter 9, verse 15, Hebrews 9:15, and chapter 10, verse 29, Hebrews 10, verse 29. But the problem that we see with these different ways of interpreting things is that there's no indication that there are two covenants with the same name. There is a new covenant with Israel, there's a new covenant with the church. Any mention of the new covenant would cause the Jewish people to think only of the new covenant first declared by Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34, which was what was read earlier. So any mention of a new covenant will cause any Jew to think of only the one that is mentioned by Jeremiah. And verses used of the new covenant for the church are quoting the Jeremiah passage. The Jeremiah passage applies it to Israel, does not apply it to the church. And so trying to somehow work this out has not been working too well. So what would be the biblical solution? The biblical solution based upon one word that's found in the 3 passages where somehow something is connected with the church concerning the new covenant, and that key word is partaker. That's the biblical solution, the partaker view. The Jewish covenants contain 2 types of promises, physical or material blessings, but also spiritual blessings. But what we're told from these passages, there is only one new covenant, and this one new covenant is made with Israel. And so Israel is the actual fulfillment of the new covenant. And the church is merely partaking of the spiritual benefits, but the church is not fulfilling the new covenant. That's being fulfilled by Israel. But they do partake of the spiritual blessings. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, the Abrahamic covenant already promised that spiritual blessings will extend to the Gentiles. And now it's being extended, but it is being fulfilled by the people of Israel. Let's look at Ephesians chapter 2, the book of Ephesians chapter 2. Look at verse 11. Ephesians 2, verse 11. Wherefore remember that once ye the Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision, but that which is called circumcision in the flesh made by hands, that you at that time separate from Messiah, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers from the covenants of the promise, having no hope without God in the world. But now in Messiah Yeshua, ye that once were far off are made nigh in the blood of Messiah. For he is our peace, who made both one and broke down the middle wall of partition, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances, that he might create in himself of the two one new man, so making peace, and reconcile them both in one body unto God through the cross, having slain the enmity thereby. Now skipping down to chapter 3, verse 5 and 6. Chapter 3, verse 5 and 6, which in other generations was not made known unto sons of men, as has now been revealed unto his holy apostles and prophets in the Spirit, that the Gentiles are fellow heirs, and fellow members of the body, and fellow partakers of the promise in Messiah Jesus through his gospel. And notice the use of the word partaker. And so emphasizes is that there are the different groups that are now partaking of the blessings of the gospel, not the gospel, but of the new covenant. That's the one. The new covenant. And so they are now recognizing that the new covenant is being partaken of. And in all these passages, I'll show you one more before we finish, that the key word is partaker. Partaking, but not fulfilling, but partaking. And so what is being taught, there is only one new covenant that was made with Israel, and the church is partaking. That's the key word he uses in 3 passages. And the church is partaking of the spiritual blessings, but the church is not fulfilling the new covenant. So in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, for example, the Abrahamic covenant was already promised. The spiritual blessings will extend to the Gentiles. And we're seeing these Ephesians chapter 2 and 3 passages. The physical blessings belong uniquely to Israel. And the church has become merely a partaker. Found in 3 passages, the church has become a partaker of the spiritual blessings of the Jewish covenants. That includes the blessing of salvation, the blessing of the forgiveness and removal of sin, the blessing of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, and that all results from the removal of the middle wall of partition. Now let's look at Romans 11 for a moment. Romans 11. What we have in the book of Romans, chapter 11, verses 16 to 24. Verses 16 to 24 is a display of the olive tree. And the olive tree is a pictorial illustration of the same doctrines we just read about. And the olive tree represents the place of blessing of the Jewish covenants, including this covenant. So the Gentile wild olive branches are partaking with the Jewish natural branches of the spiritual blessings. The Gentile wild olive branches were cut out of and then engrafted into a normal olive branch, an olive tree. So Gentile olive tree and the Gentile wild branches are partaking of the Jewish natural branches of the spiritual blessings, but the tree belongs to whom? The tree belongs to Israel. And so the tree itself is a Jewish tree. And these are Jewish spiritual blessings coming out of Jewish covenants, including the specific covenant. So look at chapter 11, and look at verse 23. Chapter 11, verse 23 of Romans. And they also, if they continue not in their unbelief, shall be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. For if you were cut out of that which is by nature a wild olive tree, and was grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more shall these which are the natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? Notice the olive tree belongs to Israel, and the natural branches are the Jewish branches, but now they've cut out of from Gentile branches, which are now grafted into the natural olive tree. So you have both natural branches, and you also have grafted olive trees, or I should say olive branches. And so of this unique olive tree, which is a Jewish olive tree with Jewish branches, now the other branches are grafted in, which are Gentile branches. But he points out, do the Gentile branches now become the owners of the olive tree? Look again at the end of verse 24. If you were cut out that which is by nature a wild olive tree was grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more shall these which are the natural branches be grafted into their own olive trees? Some of the olive trees branches were cut off because they were not believing, but once they become believers, they're grafted back into from which they were cut off, the believing olive tree. So we can see from verses 16 to 24, the olive tree is a pictorial illustration of the same doctrines. The olive tree represents the place of blessing of the Jewish covenants, including this one. The Gentile wild olive branches are partaking with the Jewish natural branches of spiritual blessings. But the tree, he specifies, in verse 24 belongs to Israel. These are Jewish spiritual blessings coming out of the Jewish covenants. So let's conclude with some points which are clear. First of all, the blood of the Messiah is the basis of salvation in the new covenant, and this was shed on the cross. The blood of the Messiah ratified and signed and sealed the new covenant. And the details of this is found from Hebrews chapter 8, verse 1 through chapter 10, verse 18. Hebrews 8, 1 through 10, 18. Secondly, the provisions of the new covenant cannot be fulfilled in, by, or through the church, but have to be fulfilled in, by, or through Israel. Thirdly, it is true that the covenant is not now being fulfilled in, by, or through Israel. That's true. But not every provision goes immediately into effect. Some go into effect in the near future, sometimes in the near distant future, sometimes in the far distant future. So it does not mean the church is fulfilling the covenant. That's being fulfilled by the people of Israel. And so the church is related to the covenant with Israel only insofar as partaking, that's the key word here, as partaking of the spiritual benefits of this covenant, like the salvation benefit, but it is not fulfilling it. So the church has become a partaker of Jewish spiritual blessings. The church, however, is not a taker-over of the Jewish covenants. The church is not a partaker of the material promises or blessings, such as the land. Now look at one more passage, Romans chapter 15, verse 25. Romans 15, verse 25. But now I say, I go unto Jerusalem, ministering unto the saints. For it had been the good pleasure of Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution for the poor among the saints that are at Jerusalem. Yea, it had been the good pleasure, and those they are. For if the Gentiles have become partakers of the spiritual things, they were to them also to minister unto them in material things. And so he points out that the other groups of peoples and so on will continue to reach out to them, but they have the position of partaking, but not taker-overs. So because the Gentiles have become partakers of Jewish spiritual blessings, they've become debtors to the Jews. The way to pay off this indebtedness is to share with the Jewish believers the material things. And that's what this passage speaks of, that they now, in verse 27, yea, they have been their pleasures and the debtors they are, for the Gentiles have been made partakers, that's the key word, of their spiritual things. They were to them also minister to them in material things. And therefore he will continue to reach out to the Gentile world because they'll become partakers, but not takeovers, of the spiritual blessings found in the Jewish olive tree. So the way to pay off this indebtedness is to share with Jewish believers their material things. The status of the new covenant is that this is an unconditional and unfulfilled and still very much in effect. It also becomes the basis of two dispensations. For the church, it becomes the basis of the dispensation of grace, but for Israel, is the basis of the dispensation of the Messianic kingdom. And this is how these things correlate quite well and easily. I'm finished.